Breaking news. Rhetoric about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine has heated up at a local forum. Last week, at a forum in which foreign policy experts arguing for and against the current United States policy in the 19-month conflict sparred over who was right, the discussion over the Russia-Ukraine war turned testy. Mordecai Kamel of Easthampton said to anti-war advocates who said the U.S. should suspend military aid to Ukraine, "You sound like people who have never heard of World War II." At the community forum held on October 16 at Forbes Library, Kamel was one of several attendees who was unconvinced by the panelists' arguments. Two panelists argued that the United States should keep its current policy toward Ukraine, while the other two said the United States should take action to bring an end to the conflict. More than 30 people showed up in person, with an additional 22 tuning in via the library's YouTube channel to watch the livestream. "It's a hot topic," said Northampton resident and event planner John Berkowitz. To question the current policy and see that there's a different approach, he urged the audience. After years of political tension over Ukraine's right to independence, Russian President Vladimir Putin launched attacks on Ukraine in February 2022. Analysts estimate that in the 19 months since the invasion began, Russia has sent 1,330,900 troops to Ukraine. This is more than twice as large as Ukraine's 500,000-person military operation, which includes active soldiers, reserve forces, and paramilitary troops. Nearly 500,000 Russian and Ukrainian soldiers have been killed or wounded in this conflict, according to the New York Times. According to the UN, over 9,600 civilians have been killed in Ukraine, and over 17,000. According to the Department of Defense, the United States has provided Ukraine with more than $29.8 billion in security assistance since the conflict began. In addition to the $105 billion in security aid requested by the Biden administration on Friday, an additional $61.4 billion was requested for Ukraine. This money would go toward supporting Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and the southern border of the United States. After meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in February, Biden said, "1 year later, Kyiv stands. And Ukraine remains. Democracy prevails. All of America and the rest of the world are behind you." According to Berkowitz, the situation is more nuanced than that. Berkowitz, who previously supported U.S. policy toward Ukraine, now favors entering negotiations to end the conflict. "I changed my mind about this war," he said. "When he, Tom Weiner, and Alan Davis all came to the same conclusion, he decided to hold a forum to discuss it with the public on Monday. Our hope is that other communities will have their own program," Davis, a longtime Northampton resident who now resides in New Hampshire, said. "As the founder put it, we want people to hear different perspectives and learn from each other." In agreement with U.S. policy, John Pfeffer, from Washington's Institute for Policy Studies, and Alina Parker, an instructor in East European and Russian Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, represented the pro-American stance on the panel. "I love Russia," Pfeffer declared. "Should I not begin by saying, I love Ukraine? I do have a lot of affection for Ukraine, but my love for Russia comes first." Pfeffer went to Moscow to immerse himself in the Russian language and culture as part of his college major. He praised the Russian people for trying to transform their society under Boris Yeltsin but blamed Vladimir Putin for making things worse. His social policies are extremely conservative, and his economic agenda is essentially corporatist. What do you get if you add those up in the dictionary? Fascism. Pfeffer essentially defined fascism with those words. When asked about the current state of affairs in Russia, the speaker said, "I love Russia, but I am appalled at what direction Vladimir Putin has taken Russia in." Ukrainian-born Parker argues that, given the devastation wrought by the conflict, it is unfair to expect the smaller country to negotiate with Russia. Should we provide military aid to the victim of this invasion, or try to force it into negotiations? Asked Parker. A negotiated ceasefire, even if it held, would only buy the Russian army some much-needed R&R. Helping Ukraine win this war and reshape itself is the only possible lesson, and it may actually serve as a deterrent for future generations. Conflict with American policy. For their part, Montague resident Patricia Hines and Northampton resident and author Howard Friel argue that the United States should temporarily halt its policy toward Ukraine in order to negotiate a ceasefire. Friel admitted that Russia had broken the cardinal rule of international law, enshrined in Article 2(4) of the United Nations Charter, which forbids the use of force or the threat of force. Friel argued that these concerns should not be used to justify keeping troops in Ukraine. Noting that Russia and the United States possess the world's largest nuclear arsenals, he expressed concern that escalating the conflict between Russia and Ukraine with the support of NATO and the US could lead to nuclear war. The longer the military conflict in Ukraine, which is largely a proxy war between the US and Russia, continues, the greater the likelihood of a nuclear confrontation, Friel said. There's rarely a happy ending to one of these wars. Hines agreed that the war's mounting death toll and environmental damage make it futile to pursue. The risks of not trying to end the war through ceasefire and peace negotiations are greater, Hines argued. She argued that instead of spending money on military action, it would be better to invest in public education and climate action. Hines argued that the world cannot afford the Green New Deal, which would cost about $5.4 trillion to implement, in order to prevent catastrophic climate chaos. Listener reaction. The panelists then took questions from the audience after their prepared remarks. Claudia Lefko from Northampton asked the panelists if the environmental impact of the war is worth it, interrupting Pfeffer, who supports current U.S. policy, as he listed the environmental damage that has occurred as a result of the war. I understand what you're saying, but my main concern is whether or not it's worthwhile. Asked Lefko. An audience member named Kamel exclaimed, if I were in Kyiv, it would be worth it. Neither Kamel nor Lefko claimed to have changed their minds about the United States' continued support for Ukraine as a result of the forum. According to Kamel, the only reasonable response to a bully is to fight back. I'm an anti-war person, Lefko retorted. The cost of bombing and war, in my opinion, is always too high.